Whew. Hello, everybody. How you doing? Thank you. Wow, good-sized room. Thank you for coming. So yeah, that's me. I'm at Eric Theise pretty much everywhere. If you want to follow tweets or anything, you can find me there. And I've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to go pretty quickly and just make sure my sound is working. Tested this before and it's not. Okay, there we go. Good. Let's go. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me just so that maybe this makes a little bit of sense. I have a pretty traditional background. I had a bachelor's degree in business. I did some engineering advanced degrees. I became an academic. The internet happened. Became a web developer. And then started doing geospatial stuff. Hang on a second. This window belongs over here. Okay, we'll skip that. Shoot. Sorry about that. All right, we'll try this one more time. No more shortcuts. Anyway, so that was that. But in parallel to that, I developed an interest in animation. And in order to see animation, I also had to go to a lot of experimental film venues, which led to me curating some program series in Chicago and later San Francisco, and then eventually make my own art. Some of my art was still photography. I did a lot of work with pinhole photographs. This will come up again later. So this is the Romaine Avenue Bridge, Romaine Street Bridge in San Francisco. Some of these were printed. We were talking about printing earlier, so these were printed as photogravures. And I also did some other etchings that ended up in an experimental film that looks something like this. And the reason I tell you this is my day job tended to be computer stuff and my art tended to be 19th century older things. But working in these techniques of real film and copper plate photogravure has the effect of cratering your finances if you're not careful with things. So my art practice kind of came to a halt for a while. And then more recently, I gave a talk at State of the Map where I realized that some of the things that I use in my daily map making could actually be considered as experimental film or experimental animation tools, and I started going down that path. So I'm going to talk about some artists, and I'm going to talk about some of their works, and I'm going to talk about how I've reinterpreted their impulses as maps that are moving. The first filmmaker and artist I want to talk about is Paul Jarris. Paul Jarris is known for pretty aggressive color strobing films, often with disturbing imagery and very relentless soundtracks that kind of wear you out in a perceptual way. Yeah, so I'm not going to show you any of his films, but I will show you some other things. Prior to a residency I did last year, I visited the Paul Jarris archive in Buffalo at the Birchfield Penny Museum. And in there you find little fragments of film, which is super exciting and unexpected. But you also find a lot of the charts that he used to plot out how his color progressed through his films, some of them simple, some of them much more involved. One of the things I was interested in was how, we were talking about color systems. Was he super concerned with color? Not really. He's like yellow, dark blue. That's about the granularity with which he discussed color. So anyway, looking through this was interesting. I'm interested in his series, which is called the Frozen Frame series, which is basically film sandwiched between plexiglass and displayed in a way that you can walk around it and see these colors just hanging in space. So there are quite a number of these, but 4 of them are in Buffalo in the vaults. And while I'm not really a selfie guy, I was pretty excited to be in the presence of these things. So I wanted to take one of those frozen film frames and use it as a driver for cartography. And the tools that I used were Python and OpenCV, which helped me get color values out of a still image that the museum provided to me. And then these fairly standard things help me generate a map. So I'm just going to show you some work here. This is something I've already shown, but what you can see here is little yellow dots in each one, and that's basically a program that ran through and took a sample of every frame in this museum quality TIFF that they gave me. This is not from a Paul Schertz film, this is from a Tony Conrad film, and it basically says if you're very sensitive to strobing, if you get headaches or motion sickness, you probably shouldn't watch some of these next few bits. This is actual just CSS rendering of the colors from the Paul Schertz frozen film frame that I sampled. And then this is a video of actually piping that color through a system called TinyColor, which allows you to basically do random operations on it. So you can darken, you can lighten, you can get a complement, you can do a split, you can do a variety of things. So the main color is always the color from the frame, but the other things that are happening with the networks and so on are permutations based on a kind of randomizing color library. But this actually happens in, I mean, if you've worked with these tools, you know this is all done at the styling level, so it actually happens quite quickly, and this is real time. This is not frame by frame sort of saving things. Okay, at the time that was done and I was finished with my residency, I had to go to Cornell and give a talk, which was very exciting. And I needed to name what I was doing. I didn't really have a good name for this, and I turned to an artist named Joe Brainerd, who was a painter but also a writer, who had an infatuation with the cartoon character Nancy. So he would reinterpret Nancy in various ways. This is probably the most reproduced. And I like this idea of if something was something. And so a lot of the series that I'm working on describes an actual situation and then transposes that into map language. So if this was that. So I call these if maps, the things that I'm going to show you in a bit. Brainerd also is well known for writing this thing called I Remember, which is 1,500 memories that all start with I Remember, that he wrote in the 60s or 70s, I don't remember, but a lot of people have found this to be a useful writing exercise. So it's actually quite well known. We'll come back to that later too. Okay, I guess the last thing I'll say about the Schertz piece that I showed you with the strobing map is that I don't have a narrative underneath it, so I actually have not completed a piece. I keep thinking about ways to do that as a fixed piece, and I haven't quite come up with what I'm satisfied with. This one is different. Scott Stark is a San Francisco-based filmmaker, and I'll play you an excerpt of one of his pieces. Scott's super prolific. He's made about 90 films. Some of the films of his I like most are ones that deal with stereo vision. So this piece, he walked through a shopping mall with 2 cameras fixed to a board, and then in editing he alternated the 2 viewpoints to provide a not successful 3D view of the world, which is what I like about it. One of the things I like about it, I like that the subject matter is very banal. I like that there's this progression from kind of washed out putty whites and silver colors to these brighter colors at the end. And I think there's something else I like, but I don't have my speaker's notes, so I can't tell you what that was. So the idea was, how do I make a map out of that? And what I decided to do, what is my next slide here? Actually, let's come back to that. So I wanted to use 3D buildings. Okay. Okay, you can watch this again. But I got the sound off. What I wanted to do was mimic this kind of binocular vision. I wanted it to somehow relate to my friendship with him, and I wanted to work with the colors. So let me show you what I've done, and I'll talk about it. I decided, in the if map sense, to walk from where I live now to where I used to live, to where he used to live, to where he lives now, which walks through Eureka Valley, Noe Valley, the Mission District, and Bernal Heights, neighborhoods of San Francisco, if you know that part of town. That's the bridge that I had a picture of earlier, that awful octagon shape. The colors were, I analyzed every frame of Scott's piece, running 12 hours on an Amazon system, and basically did cluster analysis to find the 12 most common colors plus any exceptionally bright colors, and mapped those into the layers of this map. The zoom level changes with my elevation as I walk through town. I start off pretty high, go a little bit higher, and then gradually come down before coming up. And that's that. The main thing I want to see, yeah, the elevation actually looks like this from where I start to where I end up. And the thing that I didn't expect really from this walk was that I would walk past a number of filmmakers who worked in this style but who no longer live in San Francisco. And I would also walk through some of the contested parts of town in terms of gentrification. You know, one of the Noe Valley neighborhood is now known for just being a steady stream of Google buses. So there's a certain way in which the piece, which you're not hearing the sound, there is a voiceover where I talk about the I remember sorts of things about where I lived. And it's kind of a bittersweet, it feels almost like I'm leaving San Francisco, which I'm not exactly planning to do, but that's kind of how it comes across. Anyway, this is where I'm going quite low in the landscape, and so the camera comes up quite high, and I'll let that play for a bit, because the colors get more interesting. Again, the colors come from Scott's film. How am I doing on time? Oh, great, okay. I guess the other thing I'll say at this point, because you can see the tiles are kind of breaking down here. One of the things I like about this sort of period of filmmaking and experimental filmmaking is that there was a consciousness of the mechanisms. You know, there's a thought about the camera, about the film chamber, about the projector, about the theater itself, and making those things present. And so I like pushing the limits of what the technology can do, because when we're using Google Maps or on our phone or whatever, we want a smooth experience. We try to provide a smooth experience. But I think it's interesting to show the cracks in the experience here. So that's part of what these things are for. Okay, let's move on to another project. Yes, for this one, did I mention this? I don't know if I did. I started off using a language that's used for teaching a lot called processing, because it had a nice tool for doing that kind of, here's a frame, what are the colors analysis, but it really wasn't good enough for my needs, so I ended up using Python or OpenCV again. Scikit-learn I used for the color clustering and color science. I used to do some color difference analysis and pick the bright colors that were different enough from each other in color space. That's fine too. Okay. This one I have, oh, and that film will be complete hopefully when I get back to San Francisco, and I will start submitting that to festivals. So that'll be, my piece will be about 15 minutes, and I'm looking forward to completing that. I just need to get into a quiet space where I can record my voice. Okay, prior to coming here, I went to Toronto, did some more archival research. Michael Snow's in his 90s, but is still playing music and making films and doing lots of work. One of the images you see a lot if you look at a book on experimental film is this. This is a film he made called La Région Centrale, where the camera was mounted on this device that he and an engineer designed that can pivot this way, around the axis of the lens, and it can also zoom in and out. When they filmed this, it hadn't snowed. This was the day they were leaving. This is another picture of the machine. You can see the landscape. They were on a remote mountaintop in Quebec. Lake, mountain, rocks in the foreground. And so in the archive, I was very excited to find some maps. And I looked at this one and I realized, you know, this is not the right map, because this is the one that's like torn and wet and dirty and has scribbling all over it, and this shows the actual site about, I forget how far north of the St. Lawrence River, where it kind of flattens out at Sept-Îles. There were also some aerial photographs, I think, from the 40s that are not of the actual site, but you could tell he was looking around to see where to do this. And then there's lots of information about some of the key measurements of the machine, but not all of them. Oh yeah, right. Surprised myself with my own presentation. A thing that's interesting about this film, or kind of sets the tone, literally sets the tone of the film, is that each axis of the machine is controlled by a pitch. So the soundtrack, I sure turned off my sound too soon. The soundtrack sounds like this. So the low note controls the horizontal turning of this part of the body. The higher notes control the various other axes. It's a 3-hour film, and that's the sound throughout the whole thing, is these beeps and boops. And those I did not understand quite so well from the literature. So going through the archive, you find things like his thoughts about the site before he found it, diagrams about the camera movement on the back of manila envelopes, shooting sheets. That's actually the design of the horizontal, vertical, rotational, and zoom movements of the camera machine. And this, like if you do enough research with somebody, after a couple days, you know exactly what this is. Even though you might not, it just looks like a table full of random numbers, but this was his analysis of the frequencies that propelled the machine. The film itself, you can find a 4-minute excerpt on YouTube, but it's not available online. It's actually pretty protected digitally. The Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Center allowed me to come in and work with a DVD. The film is quite beautiful with the landscape. It goes from dawn until dawn. But some of the most exciting moments are where the machine itself actually shows up as shadow. You never see the machine, but you see its shadow a few times, situations like these. And so what I've been doing, there's been a lot of talk about Blender. I'd never used Blender until a week ago. It's not for the faint-hearted, but I've basically come up with a computer model of the machine. And what I'm going to do is mount the model inside a globe and work with his soundtrack to actually mimic the machine's movements in the actual film, but do it from the inside of the globe and work with some tiled photo imagery as well as some vector imagery. And I'm excited about that. So the toolkit for that project will be that one. Whew. And then I'll show you one other thing. I was going to so all this color manipulation and working in dark studios for long periods of time made me think about different ways to work more quickly and fun things I might do. So I'm not going to explain that because it's too much to explain. And I'd hoped to give you a demo, but the networks here seem to have some kind of filter on the ports, so I can't. So I'm going to show you a couple of videos that I whipped together beforehand. Basically, I've set up this little control panel on an iPad. Each of these circles that are colors are colors that are applied to OpenStreetMap layers. So we've got background and water and land cover and boundary and transportation. The color wheel is hue, so it goes around the color wheel. The other bars are saturation value and opacity. And there are also controls for bearing and pitch. And then this is me working. This is probably, I had hoped to show you this live because I really just did this grab from a much longer video just before the session. But anyway, it allows manipulation of color and other things. There you see the street network changing to purple and so on. And really my goal with this is to become a map jockey. So I'm going to go to clubs or something and just like do that instead of my... And I think I will do that. Yeah, I have a few thank yous just to people who helped me. Signal Culture has a great residency program if you're an artist, but also if you're a toolmaker, which is how I was there. Their application is open now. It's in upstate New York. It's kind of a rundown town, but you can get a lot of work done there. And these archives were also super great to work with. So maybe I have a couple minutes for questions? One. Okay.